Hello, and welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles. Sometimes you just have to wonder what in the world was God thinking when he shuffled that deck of cards and dealt the hand you've lived with for the last 18 years. I think back on it and sometimes wish I had chosen a different response, but then I wouldn't be watching two wonderful kids setting out for a Grand Tetons adventure with half a dozen of their friends they have known since childhood. Dave was born 20 years ago, and Kylie followed 2 years later. For the last 2 decades, they have been my chief concern in life. They have had everything they needed and a good number of their wants as well, but neither of them ended up spoiled in any sense. They both held part-time jobs while in high school, and I couldn't ask for a better adjusted pair of kids. Their mother, on the other hand, well, she is a different story altogether. Her name is Tammy, and except for the fact that she is my 40-year-old wife and my name is Ted Walton, I'm not going to go into the details of the courtship and how I nailed her in the back seat of her daddy's Buick and how her daddy ran me off with a pitchfork. All true as a matter of fact. I think the 43-year-old Ted Walton of today had his start 18 years ago. When I was a young boy, my mom had a theory that if all the neighbor moms would circulate all their children together when one of them got the mumps, we could all get it over at the same time. Well, she tried. She would pack all of us off to the neighbor's house every time some kid in the neighborhood caught them. They would do the same. My brother Jimmy caught them when I was 7, and my mom just about had him coughing all over me day and night. Funny thing was I never got them, at least not until I was 20 years old. It was the most horrendous experience I have gone though. They have inoculations for it now, but then, if they did, I didn't know anything about it. I caught the mumps from the kids of one of my coworkers during a summer job between semesters. It ruined my whole summer and put a damper on certain recreational activities that Tammy and I had grown quite fond of. My armpits swelled up, my throat was worse than softballs, but the worst of all was the gonads. I literally could not walk. My balls were swollen and hurt like hell. The doctor gave me some pills and told me to stay off my feet as if that was going to be a problem, and eventually the swelling went down. However, my nuts were sore as hell all summer, and I know I wasn't the only one not happy about it. Tammy was agitated for a while, but oddly about a month before I had to go back to school, she seemed to get over it. By the time I had to leave, things were back to normal, and I tried to squeeze in as much screwing in 1 week as I lost in the summer. A year later, and we married. Both of us with fresh degrees and ready to conquer the world. We settled in a little town next door to where we grew up just outside of Memphis and decided to start a family. Well, that took over a year of trying every position known to man and woman. Some we invented. Somehow, Tammy got pregnant and David Walton came into the world. He had his mother's red hair and blue eyes instead of my brown and brown, but I could not have been more proud. I rocked him, burped him, and changed his crappy diapers. I did it all. I even weaned him when Tammy worked the night shift at the hospital. If ever there was a bond between father and son, it was with us. A couple years later, a little girl named Kylie joined the family, and Tammy now felt we were a complete family unit. She went and had her tubes tied right after the birth, not even consulting me on the matter. It was done. Whatever the case, I bonded with Kylie just as I did with Dave. A couple months after Kylie was born, I started having a nagging ache in one of my testicles, and a guy at work told me I needed to get that checked out real quick. One of his brothers had testicular cancer a few years ago, and he thought the symptoms were similar. "Ted, take this cup in there and bring back a sperm sample," she said with only half a grin on her face. She handed me an old copy of Hustler, laughing the whole time. As I walked to the bathroom, when I returned, I just smiled right back at her. A few days later, I met with my doctor. "Ted, it's mostly good news. You have a rather benign cyst on your right testicle. I'm going to remove it, and you'll be sore for a while." That is what he did, and as I was sitting there waiting for Nurse Jism to bring me the pain scripts, he made another comment. "The other interesting thing is that your sperm count came back 0. Did you get tested after you had the mumps while in college?" I shook my head. Well, with all the scarring that is evident, that was most likely the cause. If you want to have kids, you and the missus will have to adopt. The room didn't go dark, and I didn't throw a conniption fit. I thanked the doctor and Nurse Jism. I made my way out to my car and sat in it for quite a while. What the scumsucker, son of a witch. I ran out of words in short order. If I had been armed, I might have gone home and laid her out. If I've been sterile, there is no way I'm the father of my 2 kids. No way. Now, I'm generally a thinking man most of the time, and I needed to think. Did she believe I would never find out? Who was the scumsucker who screwed my wife? Do the kids have the same baby daddy? That last question struck me as important. If they have the same baby daddy, that means she has been screwing the same guy for at least the past 3 years. We've only been married less than 5. I needed to think this out. They didn't have reliable and quick DNA stuff back then, or if they did, it was way too expensive. What I did have was a good deputy friend who did some sleuthing on the side. Billy Bubba Jim Bob. "You redneck hillbilly, how are you?" He looked at me and just said, "Smart man," as he handed me an open long neck. He was my best friend in high school, and he went to a community college earning a degree in criminal justice, which is really a training school for cops. I thought he would have been an engineer or something, but he was happy doing that. Real happy. "So, you know for a fact she's taking some strange up the quim, Junior? I know somebody else put those babies in her." You remember when I had those mumps? He nodded his head. Well, it killed the swimmers is what it did. I've been firing blanks for the last 5 years. Hell, if I had known that, those rubbers would have hit the trash when we were still dating. He nodded some more, tipped up the long neck, and brought back 2 more. Okay, so here is how it works. First, you need to get a blood test for each of the kids. That's easy. Tell her that there is a free registry with the sheriff's department to protect against missing kids when some scumsucker snatches them, fingerprints, and blood samples. That way you'll know if there is a blood type problem that says for sure you aren't the father. Next, you just keep on keeping on. I'll cover her but like molasses on a stick. If so much as a fly lands on that butt, I'll know it. You just gotta cover costs. This is between friends. When he said that's what he would do, I knew he meant it. We polished off a couple more beers and before I left he told me, Junior, when we nail the prick that's tapping your woman and we know for sure, you and I are gonna go out and hook up with a couple very fine young ladies that have been giving me the playground eyes for quite some time. You are gonna get some payback sex and good. That's how we parted, and that is how we met again a couple weeks later. Okay, Junior, sit down. I did, and he laid it out for me. Tammy was photographed going into the Ramada Inn, 2nd floor, room 221 with a shithead named Michael Cookson. He's a shithead because both Billy and I knew him from our school days. Okay, here's the hard part. He slid over a VHS tape. They have been using the same room for the past month, according to the clerk, so we got him to give us access to the room and placed the camera in the ceiling vent. It's not the best picture quality, but you got sound and action and all the evidence you need that they are actually screwing each other. Hell, that's smarts, but it was real life. I didn't want to watch the video, but I took it and put it in my case. That's when I told him my plan. Billy, here's the deal. Those kids might not be mine, but I love them like they are my own flesh and blood. Somebody once told me an old cliche, but I think it's true. Revenge is best served cold. I'm going to raise my kids, but I'm going to burn those morons, but good when the time comes. I'd like the clerk to let us know if they stop showing up at the Ramada, and if they do, we'll figure out their new cooch hole. I've got 18 years in front of me to get these kids raised up right. In the meantime, let's have a couple cold ones, and see if we can't find some of that young girl you've been talking about. That's what we did, and Billy wasn't kidding. They were actually a couple nurses from the same hospital Tammy worked at. That made me a bit nervous at first, but when Michelle shimmied out of her clothes and laid back on the motel bed, I didn't waste any more time. When we were done, we made a date for a repeat. For the next couple of months, we went at it like a couple of excited high school kids. One time, she told me she saw my wife at work that afternoon. She works on our floor now, starting this week on days like us. All she talks about is you, but then she runs off with that prick she is seeing during lunch. Yeah, I know about that, the Michael Cookson a-hole. She has been screwing him for years. So why don't you leave her? I told her about the kids and why I wanted to raise them. Surprisingly, she was supportive. So you are going to just stay married until they grow up and keep a woman on the side the whole time? I looked at her closely. She was looking at me seriously, perhaps appraising me. I think that's probably the best approach. Okay, well, I'd like to stick around for the ride as long as it works. I like you. I like you a lot. So we stuck it out. Michelle and I were a good fit. She knew my wife was a cheating 304. She knew I just wanted to raise 2 children that were fathered by somebody else. And she was fantastic. After about a year, I started working my finances. I slowly started siphoning off about 10% of my income and stashing it in an out-of-state bank. When the bonuses and raises started coming in, off they went to the siphon fund. The balance kept growing and Michelle and I kept up our relationship. If anything, I think we were falling in love. In fact, I know it, but I was still married to Tammy. One thing was bothering me a bit, and I couldn't figure it out. Michelle kept telling me that all Tammy ever talked about at work was how great her husband was, how good a daddy he was, even hints about being a stud in the sack. All of it was true, of course, but if she was giving up the quim every week to that a-hole Cookson, why in hell would she talk about me all the time? I couldn't wrap my mind around that. I screwed her every Saturday night like clockwork. I couldn't have done much more because Michelle was getting the best of me on Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday afternoons. Tammy never complained or ever sought out more. I knew Cookson was nailing her once a week, so I guess twice was good enough. Did I feel like a shit screwing another woman? All I had to do was think about how she had been cucking me for years. That took care of any guilt. I think the worst part of it was I knew I was screwing Michael Cookson's longtime woman even though I was married to her. I think I wanted to kill him for the longest time. The next couple of years were pretty smooth. I was doing well in the company and received a promotion along with a pretty nice increase in compensation. Michelle moved up at the hospital and was now a charge nurse on the same floor as Tammy. That meant she was Tammy's boss. That generated a few interesting bedtime discussions, but Michelle, if she was anything, she was fair. Tammy did pretty well working for her. My siphon fund was growing nicely, and with 3 years of bonuses and increases added to it, I had almost a full year's salary tucked away already. Michelle and I sat down one evening and had a long talk. Michelle, what do you really think about me? It was one of those questions that she had to really think hard about because I wanted a serious answer. Ted, I'm going to be straight up and honest here, you know that. We've been together 4 years now, and if you were not already married, I'd be chasing you night and day to get that ring on my finger. But I know that can't happen, at least for now. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't disappointed by that. But I'd also be lying to myself if I said I didn't love you like nobody else. I get you a third of the time, and I've had to make do with that. I guess my big concern right now is that I don't want to be a kept woman. I want something to come out of this. How do we do that? I didn't have any really good answers for that. Human nature supplied them later. Michelle came in from work one day, and while she didn't say those damn words, I saw it in her face. She sat in my lap, kissed me, and led me into the bedroom. We had really great sex, and when we finished and showered, she sat me down and told me what I already knew. I stopped her with a finger to her lips. You don't have to say anything. I'll miss you greatly, and if our paths cross again down the road, I'll walk another mile or many with you anytime. She wanted a family, and I couldn't provide it. I had a family of my own to attend to, so I did. We ran into each other on occasion, and I knew she had found a guy and married him, and we remained good friends. So 4+ years after my discovery, I was back home. No Michelle and a wife who was still screwing her a-hole boyfriend. We still did our Saturday nights, so I wasn't going without, but for me, I was just getting a piece of, but off a 304. What I did still have, though, were my kids, and I showered my attention on them. I made sure to take them everywhere, and I excluded Tammy every chance I could. I took them camping, hiking, to ball games, everything. I hope I instilled everything decent needed for being well-rounded adults later. When they came home from school, it was me they came to. When they needed anything, I was the source. A few more years went by. My siphon fund was growing to a very respectable balance, and periodically, I would move funds to an offshore account and then move them again. You would have to be a serious forensic accountant to find them and link them to me. I was making 3 times what I was making 10 years earlier, yet Tammy was none the wiser. She had her own pretty decent income, and between us, the house was nearly paid off. Now, the funny thing, well, in hindsight, was that the house was titled in my name only, same thing with the mortgage. So, technically, all the equity was accruing for my use. By year 12 of the big discovery, as I started calling it, the house was paid off, and through appreciation over the years, it was worth double what we paid for it. Technically, I could pull out 80% of the equity in another mortgage when the time came without having to include Tammy in the transactions. Billy and I still hooked up regularly, although he had married a sweet girl who thought his redneck but was made of gold. She had given him a couple kids by then, so he was staked down to suburbia pretty tightly. He also didn't cheat on her, so no more nurses for him. As for me, I didn't screw around really. I made it a few times with a woman I used to work with, but for the most part one just contented myself with the Saturday night 304 sex. I made it good though. In year 15, God struck a thunderbolt right up her butt. I got a call in the middle of the night. Tammy had gone on a weekend trip with her nurse friends to the NASCAR race up in Bristol. Of course, it was all bullshit. She was on a weekend bender with a-hole Cookson. Billy had one of his PIs watching her for this one. His business was full-time now, and everything was still at cost to me. Like I said, we go way back. The call was to inform me that my wife was in a hospital in Knoxville with serious injuries. They were not life-threatening, but she had been broken up a good bit with a broken leg, a couple busted ribs, and a really screwed-up face. The kids were teens then and could handle things here by themselves, so I headed to Knoxville driving all night. Interestingly, the kids didn't have any interest in how she was doing as long as she was alive. I think I smiled about that the whole way there. She not only wasn't a good wife, she was a lousy mother as well. I got to the hospital by morning, and when I walked into her room, she looked like total shit. Her head was bandaged up completely on one side. Both eyes were completely screwed up. Her nose was broken, and according to the doctor, she had a horrific gashed and jagged cut running from her ear to her mouth. She was going to need a few surgeries to get it looking reasonable. In a word, she was a mess. No, make that 2 words, a mess. She couldn't really talk, and I really didn't want to hear anything she said, but I sat there and held her hand, going through the motions of a caring spouse. I got the straw to her mouth when she needed it. She wasn't eating anything yet, and when she got to that point, it would be liquid diet and soft foods until we got some teeth put back in her head. She had lost several front teeth as well. I asked the doctor later if there were any other injured people in the wreck, and told me that one other man had died on the scene, and there were no other passengers in the car. He looked at me sympathetically but didn't offer any other information. The police officer who came by later was much more forthgiving. Mr. Walton, I'll be plain speaking here. Your wife was a passenger in the car. One Michael J. Cookson was the driver, and he was killed on impact. There were no other passengers in the vehicle. Now, just as plain, Mr. Walton, Mrs. Walton is one lucky woman. She should have died in that crash just like the driver. For whatever reason, she was laying down in the back seat, or so we think, and the seat back saved her life somehow. I don't know how, but they did. The driver, on the other hand, was ejected from the vehicle and killed upon impact with the concrete abutment. If you have any further questions, Mr. Walton, here's my card. With that, the officer left and I stood in the hallway just outside my wife's room. I can't say I was happy. Instead, I had an empty hollow pit feeling. In spite of all the cheating and cucking me with somebody else's baby daddy offspring, I still loved the woman I married. I just couldn't stand her. I stayed through Monday morning, and by then, Tammy had most of her wits about her. She wouldn't be walking anywhere soon and would most likely be in the hospital for the rest of the week. I called my work and took some leave. I then called the kids, and everything was okay there. They were more concerned now and wanted to drive over. I let them make that decision. They showed up at the hotel later that evening. So, over the course of the week, Tammy gained a bit of strength and was ready to be discharged. We got her into my car with her broken leg, bandaged ribs, and really screwed up face. Kylie rode back with me, and Dave drove his own car back. It was mostly a quiet ride, and with Kylie in the car, I wasn't going to bring up anything about who she was riding with. The scumsucker certainly wasn't a nurse. Tammy couldn't talk much anyway, so it was mostly Kylie and I chatting. I looked over at her a couple of times and noticed the tears. The problem was I didn't know if the tears were because of the physical pain, her sorrow for what she had done, or her grief for the death of her long-time lover and baby daddy. At the same time, my heart hurt from the culmination of all this shit. I started doing some math in my head, again for the umpteenth time. She had to have been screwing that a-hole for at least 19 years. We had been married 18. I had run it around in my head a few times before. I remember the summer I had those mumps a year before we got married, and how all of a sudden she was quite content not getting screwed, right out of the blue. I also knew that a-hole was around that summer because Billy and I both ran into the smug scumsucker one evening at the dairy hall. If my hunch was right, she had been giving him her sweet quim for 19 years. Hell, why didn't the scumsucker just get his own wife? I needed answers to that question someday. From Tammy. I knew I was getting mad, so I just took a breath and finished the ride. We got the witch settled in at home, and I went for a ride. I needed to clear my head. I was time to take the next steps, and with Cookson out of the way, I pretty much knew what I had to do. The reason I put myself through all this hell was because that baby daddy could have taken my kids away. Now, his putrid gray matter was plastered all over a concrete abutment on the side of a road on the other side of the state. I didn't need to worry about that anymore. I pulled my financial trigger. The house was worth almost 4 times what we paid for it almost 18 years ago. All the equity was in my name, even though in a divorce she would get half. My solution was simple. I took out an 80% equity loan against the house and walked out of the bank with $520,000. I didn't need her signature or knowledge of it at all. The title was in my name. I made 2 trips to Vegas over the next 2 months. I played some slots, gambled a bit, left some receipts here and there, and then parked most of that money in an offshore account. After 15+ years of doing this, I had almost $1.5 million squirreled away in offshore accounts that Tammy would have no way of knowing about. She would learn about the income and savings we held jointly, and I'd have to split that, but that was okay. I started buying a lot of lottery tickets and putting up a front of somebody who liked to gamble. If I got called on it, I'd just tell them I found out my wife had been cucking me for 18 years. Who in hell wouldn't have sympathy for me then? Tammy was slowly healing. The broken bones healed quickly. The facial injuries were more extensive. She had a lateral cut that had opened up her mouth all the way to her ear, and the scar tissue was awful since pieces of flesh had been ripped and were missing. Her nose had been flattened and straightened out, but it was clear it has been busted before. Tammy was always pretty, and she still was, but she wouldn't be making the covers of any magazines unless it was Mechanics Illustrated. She would also walk with a slight limp because of the extent of her leg injuries. After about a year, she was walking with that limp, and her face had pretty much healed, although with a unique Scarface appeal to it. She looked tough, like she had been in a few biker chick brawls. We had never talked about her weekend. Now was the time. So, Tammy, how did you happen to be in a car speeding down I-40 doing 80 miles per hour with a guy named Michael J. Cookson at 1 a.m. in the morning and live to tell about it? Huh. She kind of looked at me a bit sheepishly and then went for subtle defiance. It wasn't at all what you might think, Ted. That's interesting. I would have thought on a Saturday night you would have been upstairs getting that little quim of yours screwed to the mattress. Wait, you were on a road trip with nurses to go to the races. Now I remember. Tell me the truth, Tammy. I didn't think she would say it, but she went for a bit of it. Okay, I screwed up, all right, and look at me. Don't you think I'm paying for it? I spent the night with him, Dash. Hold it. Not the whole night. He spent the rest of the night smeared against a concrete bridge, or what was left of him. She started crying at this point. Who was he to you? A pickup, somebody you work with, longtime screw? I think I startled her at that point into thinking I didn't remember who Cookson was. Ted, he was a one-time thing. I swear. The girls and I were drinking too much and I got carried away. Next I knew we were heading down the highway and then, God, it was horrible. She started crying again. I wanted to laugh. So you didn't screw him? She shook her head no. Her face was a mess with the tears and that garish scar creeping down to the corner of her lip. She looked like half a Joker without the face paint. I seriously wanted to laugh. She had been screwing the a-hole for 2 decades, and she says it was a one-timer without a sex. Tammy, I believe you as far as I can throw you, which is about 5 feet. Is there anything else you want to tell me before we end this conversation? I'm telling you the truth, Ted. I just walked away shaking my head. I hadn't screwed her since the week before her accident, and I pretty much knew then I wouldn't be touching her again. I started making plans. Then I really did gamble. Dave was 18 years old now and had just graduated. Kylie was almost 16 and would start her junior year in high school. I decided it was time to tell them and see what they would do. I had enough money stashed now, and they were old enough that there wasn't much more influencing left for me to do with them. So I started to lay it all out. Guys, we need to talk. I had just bought us all a cold pop, ginger ale. I need to tell you guys something about your mom and me, and you guys too, I guess. Kylie interrupted me. Dad, there isn't any need. This is about Mom and her shit brain-dead boyfriend, isn't it? I looked at her a bit incredulously. We know, both Dave and I. I think we figured it out when I was around 13 or so. It also helped to find your secret stash above the garage. You need a better hiding spot. We both saw the old pictures and found the old VHS tape. We saw the blood test results and know what they mean. Plus, we went one step further than you, Dad. We got a DNA test done. It's easy to do now and we know. You are our real dad regardless of who was popping Mom's rocks on the nights we were made. You raised us, fed us, nurtured us, and taught us everything we know about how to be good people, and you were stuck with us whether you like it or not. I didn't know what to say. I was looking at a 35-year-old, 16-year-old. They both hugged me and I wept. After I pulled myself together, because men shouldn't get like that, I looked at them and told them I was ready to leave their mother, but they were old enough to make decisions for themselves. Kylie came right out with it again. Dad, I'm not going to stay with my mom. She might have given birth to me, and maybe way down the road someday, I'll think different. But, for now, I'm going to walk away from her. I have been waiting knowing you were going to leave, but also knowing you were staying just because of us. So, if I have a choice, I'll stay with you. Dave chimed in at that point. Dad, we already checked with a lawyer. Kylie can make that choice once she's 16, and that's next month. So it was a plan. My kids were already in the know. Tammy was in denial, and I was ready to make the break. Then I started having second thoughts. The scumsucker was dead. My wife was a busted-up mess of a woman, and I had nobody to go to. I was only 41, and certainly young enough to make a good go at another woman. Hell, that was the plan all along. Raise him up, head on out. Tammy got her old job back after a few long talks with HR and the nursing supers. She even started back up with her benefits and salary increases in line with where she left off. Financially, she would be okay. Well, except she didn't know about the big mortgage on the house. There was only about 20% equity left to speak of. I laid the papers out in front of her one evening with the simple splits, 50/50ths down the middle. I told her about my gambling problems and how I didn't have anything left, and then I told her why. Tammy, I know all about Michael Cookson. You remember when I had those mumps years ago? And I couldn't screw you the way you wanted. Hell, the way I wanted to. I know that Michael Cookson was tapping your little Quim way back then. She tried to protest, but I held up my hand. You remember how we tried a baby into you back when we first got married? Somehow a miracle occurred. Then the same thing with Kylie, but I recall you didn't try so hard with me that time, but still, you got knocked up. But there is something you don't know. I pulled out my test results that showed 0 swimmers from the doctor's office those many years ago. The paper was a bit yellowed, but she could read it. Her jaw dropped when she realized what it said. Then I pushed a photo in front of her. It was her going into the Ramada Inn, room 221 2 months after Kylie was born. She looked up at me. You've known all these years and said nothing? I nodded and continued. I needed to raise my babies, Tammy. They might not have my genes, but they have my name, and I've loved them more than anything since I first laid eyes on them. You want to know more? They know too. I didn't tell them. They figured it all on their own. Was Cookson their baby daddy? She nodded yes and stared at the floor. Tammy, look up at me. I betted you as my wife once a week for most of the last 17 years since I've known. I didn't shirk my duty as your husband. Now, I wasn't always faithful, but then, my marriage died when I found out 17 years ago. You have never been faithful. I guess my question is a simple one. Why? She stared at the floor for a long time before replying. Ted, I wish I knew why I didn't stop it a long time ago. Fear, I guess, afraid you would find out and leave. By the time I found courage, it was too late. Michael Cookson, and yes, he was an a-hole, started by blackmailing me. You are right that I had screwed him when we were young before getting married. It was a mistake, and it only happened a couple of times. Then a bit after we got married, I was out with some of my work friends, and we were drinking at some bar. Well, I ended up drinking too much, and of all people, Michael showed up. I honestly don't remember all that much after then, other than I know he was screwing me on a couple occasions that night. I think one of the nurses gave me cover and called you, telling you she was taking me home with her as I was puke drunk. Well, Michael used me all night. He took pictures, everything. A week later, he met me at work and laid it out. I'd have to screw him, or you would know. Then the worst happened. I was pregnant and I knew right off the bat it had to be Michael's. I watched the calendar religiously and I ended up being a stupid drunk sex right at the height of my fertility. I could have died. I was in for a pound at that point. Michael had me every week until I got too big. After Dave came, he was after me again, telling me he would tell you the baby was his. I was mortified, so I relented. I ended up getting knocked up again a year later, and when Kylie was born, I had my tubes tied so it couldn't happen again. To keep Michael quiet, I agreed to let him do it once a week. I thought he would grow tired of me and move on. I prayed he would, but he never did. I put up with him and my shame for all these years. I think I realized several years ago that it would never end well, but my denial kept me going. I never once had an orgasm with the man. I was just a piece of meat to him, and after 15 minutes, he was up and gone, every time. So now you know why, Ted. Push me those papers and I'll sign whatever you want me to, and I'll get out of your way. She sat there looking at her hands, and I pushed the papers in front of her. She didn't even read them. She just signed them. Ted, if you want, I'll take them to the lawyer's office and sign them again in front of them if they need me to. At that, she got up and went into the other room and sat down in her easy chair and cried. She was a completely broken woman. If what she said was true, she submitted to blackmail all these years just to keep me from finding out what I already knew. I looked at the papers on the table and picked them up and put them in my case along with the evidence of her infidelity. I had told her I wasn't always faithful over these years, but I didn't tell her about Michelle. That was just a sweet memory that was a could have been in another life. The life I had lived was as a cucked man raising another man's 2 children and loving every moment with them. I just didn't know what to believe from her anymore. When I looked back on it, it was worth it. I had kept my promise to myself to raise them as mine and have 2 children that loved me when they became adults. I would be able to watch them get married and have grandchildren to play with. It is what I wanted with my wife when I married her. So, we drifted like that for the next year and a half or so. I had the papers still in my case. Tammy was making the payments on a house she couldn't afford. I had taken a small apartment nearby, and Kylie had moved in with me until I told her that she really needed to stay with her mom, or it could be that she might not have a mom left. Tammy was slowly falling to pieces, and I think she needed the support. After Kylie moved back home, things started to even out a bit. The two of them seemed to bond somewhat, and Kylie began doing things with her mom. I encouraged her, and at one point I even sat down and explained what Tammy had told me about Michael Cookson. I considered it therapy for the both of them. Dave had gone off to school in Knoxville, and I was living the boring middle-aged single life. I hadn't chased any women, although I certainly had the opportunity. When the office heard that I was living on my own, I was surprised how many single, divorced women were working in my building. I got invited to everything. The women who had never been married were few, but the divorcees were like sharks in the water looking for fresh blood. I was sitting in a park one morning just watching the kids play and enjoying the fresh air. A little girl and her mom caught my eye, and there was just something familiar about the mom that I could not for the life of me put my finger on. I watched them play and run with each other, and there was a wonderful joy between them. It reminded me of when my kids were young. At some point, the mom stood up and pulled her cap off her head, and a long cascading flow of blonde curls fell loose down her back, and when she turned toward my direction, I realized who she was. It was Michelle. I sat back and watched them play. I didn't know she was still living in the area. In fact, I was certain she had married and moved away. They were tossing a ball around, and at some point it rolled over toward where I was seated. I reached down and picked it up, tossing it toward the young girl running my way. When she was closer, I recognized her as her mother's daughter. She was the spitting image. The little girl ran back down toward her mom, and they resumed. Michelle didn't notice me, that I could tell, and I rose up and left the park. I was having coffee one morning down on the corner from my place, and she slid in across from me. "Ted, you are looking good these days." "Michelle, I could say the same." We appraised each other for a bit. "You didn't come over and say hi the other day." "Neither did you?" "I didn't want to rile a husband if he were lurking. It wouldn't be fair to him." She laughed lightly at that. "He's been gone for 3 years now." "Oh, I'm sorry." "Don't be. I caught him screwing our next-door neighbor and nearly castrated him right there." "Well, you know, I can appreciate the sentiments." We sipped our coffees and chatted about everything for quite a while. Her little girl was 6 and her name was Cassie. She had been born in Atlanta, and when the marriage went south, Michelle brought the two of them back to the area and was living in Memphis until recently. "So did you ever divorce her?" she asked. "I have the signed papers at home, but I haven't had them processed." I think she pondered that for a good while before a small smile crossed her lips. "You've got a soft heart, Ted. I've always loved that about you. Are you going to give her a chance to redeem herself?" I needed to answer that question. We were not a couple yet. I hadn't really pulled the trigger and didn't know why. I remembered loving her those years ago. I remembered Michelle tell me how much Tammy talked about me at work. Then, just as quick, I would recall that scumsucker screwing my wife year after year. "I think I'm just trying to find the time." I lied. She just chuckled. When she finished her coffee, she pulled out a business card from her bag and handed it to me. "Ted, please call me sometime and let's have lunch. I'm back at the hospital here and, well, sometimes I just like to have a friend to talk to, and I'm a good listener." We hugged each other, and I watched her leave and cross the street to her car. Later that evening, I was looking over the divorce papers, and I came to a conclusion that I was going to give Tammy a chance to redeem herself. She looked tough as an old bird, but she did her best. She was actually quite attractive in her own jailbird kind of way. I headed over to the house and sat in the driveway for the longest time. I opened my case and pulled out all the papers, including copies of the infidelity evidence. My eyes fell to her eyes at the Ramada Inn. I shook my head and backed out of the drive as she stood there watching me. I got a wheel and actually laughed all the way down the street. The next morning, I dropped the papers off at the lawyer's office, told him to file, and I went out and bought the biggest cheeseburger I could find and washed it down with 2 Sam Adams. Staring at the old photograph and the close-up of the couple, I peered into the eyes of lovers and not those of a victim and her perpetrator. The other thing I never noticed before or paid any attention until the photo was blown up was the oversized high school varsity jacket she was wearing. I never had one, but that scumsucker Michael Cookson did. I sat on that bench watching my 2 kids board the plane for an adventure with several of their friends. Cassie ran up to me just as they were going through the gate. Her mom was right behind her. I gave both of them a big hug, and we waved at the departing entourage. The day I ate that cheeseburger was the day I knew I was going to marry Michelle, and we set the date during dinner last night with my 2 kids, Cassie, Michelle, and I. Dave will be my best man. Kylie will be a bridesmaid, and Cassie will be the flower girl. Tammy didn't take it too well for a while, but she learned to adjust. I think she also understands I could care less. As for my stash, she knows nothing about it, and I just paid off my kids' college educations up front, and tomorrow, I'm paying cash for a new home for the 3 of us to grow old and happy in. It's been an 18-year engagement. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.